He lived alone in the freezing wild for 6 years until the day he found a half-dead child in the snow, and everything changed. What followed wasn't just survival. It was the unexpected birth of a family forged in fire silence and the bitter cold of a Wyoming winter. This isn't just a frontier tale. It's a story about what's still possible when we think all hope is gone. The first thing Samuel Briggs saw was the wind slicing sideways through the pine trees like a blade tearing snow from the branches and hurling it across the frozen valley. The second thing he saw stopped him cold, a shape too still to be anything living. But he was wrong. It was alive. Barely. It was a boy. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Long before the boy, long before the 3 women, long before Samuel Briggs found himself pacing the worn trail to the north fence with a rifle slung low and a storm pressing hard against his back, there was silence. Silence deeper than any wind, any death, any prayer. It was the kind that grew roots in the walls, sank into your bones, and stayed long after you forgot what laughter sounded like. That silence had been Samuel's only companion for 6 winters. His cabin, squatted alone in the white stretch of wilderness east of Jackson Hole, Wyoming, far from town, farther from memory. The roof leaned westward from years of wind, and the wood was old enough to speak when it settled at night. But it stood. So did Samuel. That was enough. He hadn't spoken more than 20 words to another soul in over a year. Since Marlene passed, since the sickness took her breath and left Samuel with only a cracked wedding band and a hole in his chest, he had chosen quiet over company stillness, over sorrow. It was safer that way. He fed his mule-chopped wood, fixed fences repeated, until that morning. The wind woke him early. It wasn't the kind that made you pull the covers tighter, it was the kind that whispered wrong. It gnawed at the corners of the windows, curled under the doorframe, and told him in a language older than fear that something was off. He dressed slow, same as always. Long John's wool trousers, canvas coat scarf wrapped twice. The stove was still warm from the night's fire. He boiled water for coffee hand-ground like every morning, and stood by the window staring out into the white. Nothing moved. And yet he moved. Something pushed him, some instinct that lived in the place between heartbeats and reason. He saddled the mule and headed northeast toward the fence line he'd checked 100 times before. The ride was rough wind slicing across the plains, snow biting at his eyes. The land stretched wide and cruel, the kind that showed you everything except what mattered. He'd learned during the war to look for absences. Not what was there, but what wasn't. And there slumped beside a crooked post was a shape that didn't belong. He dismounted, boots crunching in the brittle frost. One hand hovered near his hip, not because he expected trouble, but because old habits die hard. He approached the mound slowly. It was a boy. A child, no older than 5 or 6, curled into himself like a leaf trying to escape the wind. Barefoot, skin the color of dust and ash. His fingers had gone blue, his cheek pressed into the snow. The only warmth came from the faint dying ash of a tiny fire that had long since surrendered to the cold. He wasn't dead, but he was close. Samuel knelt, his breath caught in his throat. The boy's ribs moved barely. His lips were cracked. A thin buckskin shirt clung to his bony shoulders, torn and frayed. No coat, no boots, no sound. Samuel hesitated not out of fear, but out of memory. He knew what it meant to open your door in winter. It meant more mouths to feed more risk, but also more noise. And for a man who had lived with ghosts for too long, the sound of breath, however faint, was a reason. He pulled off his coat, the only one he owned that could hold back the mountain wind, and wrapped it around the child. The boy didn't stir. Samuel lifted him carefully, surprised by the weight light as kindling nothing but bones and hope. He muttered to himself, "All right then," and turned back toward the cabin. The ride back took longer. The wind was meaner. Samuel didn't rush. One hand held the reins, the other cradled the child against his chest. Every hoofbeat was a prayer. Inside the cabin, he laid the boy near the stove, added cedar to the fire, and watched the flame grow. Then he worked. Water warmed, hands cleaned, broth made, words never spoken. The boy swallowed once. Enough. Samuel didn't sleep that night. He sat in the chair watching the rise and fall of a chest that barely moved. The wind slammed against the walls. Snow hissed under the door. But in that small cabin in the middle of nowhere, something had shifted. A man who had nothing left had chosen to give again. Not because he knew what would happen next, not because he expected thanks or redemption, but because sometimes the cold finds you, and sometimes you answer. The boy didn't speak the next day or the one after, but his eyes opened. He drank. He watched, and when Samuel moved across the room, he followed him with his gaze not fearful, not trusting. Just there. The fence still needed fixing. The mule still needed feeding. Life didn't pause. But now there was another plate on the table. A coat hung drying near the fire, and a child breathing. Samuel never asked who the boy was or where he came from. But that question, who left you out there, who let you nearly die, it burrowed deep, waiting for an answer. And 3 days later it would come, on the ridge, in the form of 3 women. But for now, in the hollow of that storm, Samuel Briggs had done something extraordinary. He had let life back in. He had not spoken a word to the boy, and the boy had not spoken to him, but something had already begun to shift in the air between them. The fire crackled low. That third morning the kettle hissed softly on the stove, and outside the wind had settled just enough to let the cold speak for itself. That kind of cold doesn't lie. It tells you the truth about the world. It says, nothing is guaranteed, not warmth, not life, not even another sunrise. Samuel Briggs was splitting wood behind the cabin when he heard it, the sharp snort of his mule. He paused mid-swing, axe frozen above the stump. The mule had wandered closer to the northern edge of the property, ears twitching, stance uneasy. Samuel squinted toward the ridge, and then he saw them. 3 figures, silent, standing like ghosts carved from the wind. At first he thought it was a trick of the trees, maybe shadows playing off the snow. But as they moved forward, slow, deliberate steps, his chest tightened. 3 women. Shoshone, he could tell by their dress and bearing. They didn't call out, didn't raise their arms or wave. They just stood watching. He didn't move. Something in their stillness was heavier than any weapon. The tallest one in front stepped forward, not hurried, not cautious, just sure. Her dress was tattered at the hem, patched with careful hands, the kind that don't waste a single thread. Her face was strong. Not hard, not broken, just weathered like the bark of an old pine that had seen too many winters. "You have our son," she said. No accusation, no pleading, just a fact spoken soft, and even like the wind itself had carried the words. Samuel's throat tightened. He looked past her at the other 2. One was younger, sharp-eyed jaw set like someone ready for trouble. The other stood hunched older, maybe, or simply more tired. Her gaze flicked between the cabin and the trees like she expected something worse to arrive behind them. The boy was still asleep inside, wrapped in his coat, breathing easier but not strong. Samuel hadn't planned for any of this. He hadn't thought about what came next. He hadn't dared. But now it was here standing on the rise, asking without asking. He nodded slowly. He's inside. The lead woman didn't move. She waited, The others remained still as stone. Samuel knew that posture. It was what you did when the world had taught you not to expect kindness, when you'd spent enough time bearing hopes to know not to raise them again too quickly. He stepped aside. "Come in." They crossed the yard without a word. The snow didn't crunch under their feet, it whispered. Inside the cabin, the warmth struck them like a wall. For a moment, none of them moved. The scent of cedar, the soft flicker of firelight, the sight of a child asleep in the corner. These things aren't always enough to mend broken trust, but they're a start. The tall woman went straight to the boy. She knelt slow and reverent and reached for him. His eyes blinked open. Recognition flickered. No words passed between them. None were needed. He reached for her, and she gathered him into her arms like he had always belonged there, like nothing else mattered. The younger woman stepped inside and closed the door behind them. The older one lingered near the wall, her eyes never still, like a deer waiting for the next sound to mean danger. Samuel backed away, gave them space. His hands felt awkward at his sides. He moved to the stove, poured water into a tin cup, and slid it across the table. Then, wordless, he opened the small larder and took out what little remained jerky dried beans, a crust of hard bread. He placed them near the fire. "Eat," he said. The tall woman, still holding the boy, finally spoke. "Thank you." Her voice cracked the quiet like a single bird call at dawn. She broke the bread, handed a piece to the boy, another to each woman. They ate slowly, silently. Not from fear, but from habit. People who've starved don't rush, they memorize each bite. "I'm Kaya," she said after a while. Samuel nodded. "Samuel," another long pause. "Then why did you help him?" Samuel didn't look at her. He poked the fire with a piece of kindling. Didn't feel right, letting him die. Kaya studied him. Her fingers gently stroked the boy's back, steady and slow. "No," she said. "It wouldn't have been." The older woman made a small noise, then almost a cough, and sat down beside the fire. The younger one remained standing her back near the door, eyes never resting. That night, Samuel didn't speak much. He laid out extra furs, filled the pot with water, kept the fire high. When he cleaned his rifle, he caught Kaya watching him, not with fear, not quite with trust. Just watching the way someone watches a stranger who's done something kind, but might change his mind. He slept in his chair again, rifle beside him, boots near the door. The wind howled outside. But inside the cabin, the world was different. There were 5 breaths instead of 2. A hum of quiet voices in the dark. A crackling fire that didn't feel lonely anymore. Samuel Briggs had lived a long time without needing anyone. But tonight, something about the silence felt less like solitude and more like the start of something else. And though he didn't know it yet, that moment when 3 shadows stepped out of the snow and into his life was the true beginning of everything that followed. The cold had found them. But now they weren't alone. The morning after the women came, the wind didn't howl quite as loud. The cold was still there, settling into every seam of the cabin, every crack in the timber. But something about it felt less cruel, as if the storm outside knew that inside something stronger than frost had taken root. Samuel rose before the sun. The fire had burned low, but it hadn't gone out. That felt important somehow. He added wood, stirred the coals, and watched the embers glow back to life. Behind him, 4 people still slept. 4. He mouthed the number to himself not out of disbelief, but to remind himself it was real. Kaya lay closest to the stove, the boy tucked beside her under his coat, her hand resting protectively across his chest. The older woman, Lila, had rolled herself tightly in a blanket and barely moved. The younger one, Mina, lay nearest the door, one arm beneath her head, the other curled around a worn knife handle. Samuel had not planned on waking up to a room full of strangers, but it didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a story beginning. That day passed slow and steady, the kind of day where work fills the quiet better than conversation. He chopped more wood, checked the fence line, brought in another pail of water from the well, though it nearly froze solid in his hands. Every time he stepped back into the cabin, the warmth wrapped around him like something alive. He noticed the small things first. Lila had swept the floor with a tied bundle of reeds she must have found behind the cabin. Mina had rearranged the tools near the hearth with a sort of military precision. And Kaya, she had boiled roots she found outside the tree line, adding them to the stew pot with a quiet grace that spoke of years learning how to make little into enough. The boy, whose name he would later learn was Toma, had begun to sit up more often. He didn't speak, but his eyes followed Samuel with interest. When Samuel walked to the window to check the weather, Toma leaned just enough to watch. When he stirred the fire, Toma's gaze stayed on his hands. He was studying him like a child trying to understand what kind of man had saved him and what kind of world he had been brought into. That night they ate together. Not much a thin stew and hard bread, but it was more than Samuel had shared with anyone in years. No one filled the silence with talk. No one seemed to need to. It was the kind of quiet where people are simply glad to be breathing. Later, when the boy coughed and stirred in his sleep, Kaya got up and walked to the stove. She poured warm water into a cloth and pressed it gently against his lips. Samuel watched from his chair. Her hands moved with such care, such certainty, it made his throat tighten. That kind of tenderness was something he'd forgotten how to name. After she returned to her place beside the boy, she glanced over at Samuel. Their eyes met. Not long, just long enough. He rose without a word, grabbed his coat, and stepped outside into the bitter dark. The wind had picked up again, biting and restless. He stood by the woodpile, letting it cut across his face. He thought of Marlene, of the years that had followed her death, of how quickly you can slip into thinking solitude is safety. But now, in that cabin, were 4 people who had carried themselves through some kind of hell and chosen, whether by desperation or instinct, to rest under his roof. And despite everything he thought he knew, Samuel felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years, usefulness. He turned back inside, shaking off the snow. The fire was still burning, casting long shadows across the walls. Kaya sat upright now, watching the flames. Lila snored faintly. Mina had shifted closer to the fire, her knife still in hand, but her body no longer tense. "Storm's building again," Samuel said softly. Kaya nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "We've seen worse." He believed her. She turned back to the fire, but her shoulders had softened slightly. She wasn't relaxing, not yet, but she was staying. In the days that followed, they moved around each other with the awkward rhythm of people learning new steps to an old dance. There were no rules, no chores assigned, but everyone did something. Lila mended a tear in Samuel's coat without asking. Mina sharpened the dull knives by the door. Kaya organized the food stores, counted what remained, and made notes with pieces of charcoal on the cabin wall. Samuel kept doing what he always did. He worked. But now his work had purpose. He began to speak more just small things. Fire needs tending. Frost's heavier this morning. Watch your step out by the creek. The boy listened to every word. Mimicked the way Samuel stirred his coffee. Sat by the door when Samuel put on his boots as if waiting to be told he could come along. And one morning he did. Samuel led Toma to the barn, his small bare feet tucked into a pair of old wool socks and moccasins. They walked the fence line together. Samuel explained how to check for gaps. Toma didn't answer, but he nodded once, solemn as a grown man. When they returned, Kaya was waiting at the door. She said nothing, just wrapped her arms around the boy and kissed the top of his head. Toma let her, but his eyes stayed on Samuel. That night they all sat around the fire. Toma, between Kaya and Lila Mina, polishing a hunting knife she'd found in Samuel's old trunk. Samuel stared into the flames, letting the heat ease his knees. He looked around the cabin and realized something. It didn't feel like it was just his anymore. And for the first time in 6 years he didn't mind. The fire hadn't just stayed lit. It had been shared. The snow didn't stop falling. It came thick and steady, blanketing the world until the edges blurred, and the days became hard to count. Outside, the cabin stood like a stubborn memory refusing to be erased. Inside, something delicate was beginning to take shape, something that looked suspiciously like belonging. One morning, before the sun broke, the ridge, Samuel found Kaya outside. She stood barefoot, wrapped in his old coat arms, crossed tight against her chest, staring across the fields like she was waiting for something to rise from the snow. Her breath came slow and visible, her dark hair braided down her back, dusted white. "You're cold," Samuel muttered, stepping out with his boots crunching the snow. "I've been colder," she said without turning. Her voice wasn't defiant, only tired. He shrugged off his scarf and handed it to her. She hesitated, then took it without thanks, wrapping it around her shoulders. That was the moment he realized how fragile the air between them still was. Trust wasn't spoken. It was built in moments like these quiet offerings with no expectations. The boy, Toma, had begun to speak in whispers. Not many words and rarely to Samuel, but when he sat beside Kaya sometimes he'd murmur things in a mix of Shoshone and English. His voice was soft, like it was still relearning how to exist. Mina took him out once, just around the cabin, walking slowly through the packed snow. When they returned, his cheeks were red, and he laughed a real sound that startled even himself. Lila looked up from sewing and smiled without being told to. The rhythms of survival were no longer just about getting through the day. They became something deeper, cooperative, intentional. Tula sang now when she worked soft tunes that Samuel didn't recognize, but found comfort in. Mina still watched the door, but her shoulders no longer clenched when Samuel passed by. They shared chores like it had always been that way. One evening, as the fire burned down and the boy curled into Kaya's side, Samuel sat sharpening his blade. He wasn't thinking about anything in particular, just the weight of the blade and the soft scrape of steel when Kaya spoke. "He needs a father." Samuel looked up. Her voice was plain, not accusatory. "I'm not asking," she added quickly. "He'll grow up either way, but boys without men to follow." She paused, watching Toma breathe. They get hard too early, or wild. Samuel leaned back, placed the knife on the table. "I'm not much for talking." Kaya didn't look at him. "You don't have to talk," she said. "Just stay." That night no one said where to sleep. No one needed to. The fire was stacked high. Toma curled against Kaya. Lila stretched out beside the hearth Mina at the window. Samuel sat in his usual chair by the fire, but when Kaya came near she didn't ask. She just sat next to him. Their knees touched. Her head found his shoulder, and Samuel didn't move. It snowed through the week. Hard, the kind that broke fences and buried traps. But Samuel wasn't alone in keeping the place together. Kaya took to the routine like she'd always lived this way. She chopped kindling, hauled buckets of water, helped him clear the shed path with a quiet efficiency he respected. One afternoon as they worked side by side near the chicken coop, Kaya said, "You used to live with people. It wasn't a question." Samuel nodded. "Soldiers, then ranchers, then just me and Marlene." "She died here?" Kaya asked. "In that bed," he said. "Pneumonia." Silence hung between them. Then Kaya said, "It's a good place to die. Warm." He didn't respond. He couldn't. That evening after dinner, as Toma dragged a stick across the hearth and Lila hummed, Kaya approached him again. "You never asked who we were before. Didn't think it mattered," he said. "It might," she replied. "We weren't wives, not in the way your kind says it. We were what was left. After the men were gone, sickness, raids, soldiers." Samuel said nothing. "Our own people called us cursed," Kaya added, "because we survived." "You don't look cursed to me," he said simply. She stepped closer, the firelight catching her cheek. "You don't flinch when I say that." "I don't flinch at much anymore." She placed a hand on his chest. Not to seduce, not to demand, just to feel. Her breath warmed the space between them. "I want to be yours," she said, "but only if you see me. Not because I'm here, not because I'm soft, because you see me." Samuel looked at her, really looked. Her body, her breath, the quiet way she had endured. He pulled her into his arms. They said nothing that night, but when she lay beside him, her hand on his chest, the boy sleeping peacefully by the fire, something that had been long dormant in him cracked open. Not loud, not quick, but enough. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, something was beginning to grow. It began with a sound. Not a shout or a storm, not even birdsong. Just the faint drip of water from the edge of the roof. Samuel heard it as he stepped outside one morning, boots crunching against packed snow. He paused, tilted his head, and listened. Another drop, then another. In the stillness of winter, it was the loudest thing he'd heard in days. The thaw had started, quiet, slow, inevitable. And so had the changes. Inside the cabin, the rhythm had shifted. The furs, once strewn in messy piles, were now folded, stacked neatly near the hearth. The cracked window pane had been patched with oilcloth, stitched by Mina's careful hands. A new mat lay where Toma now slept, woven from dried reeds Lila had gathered during a short break in the storms. Toma had grown stronger. He ran now, not far, but far enough to make Kaya call after him with laughter in her voice. He spoke more too, not just to Kaya or Lila, but to Samuel. His words came hesitantly, like someone testing the strength of new ice. Sometimes in English, sometimes in Shoshone. Always careful. Always with those wide, watchful eyes. Wren had made herself useful in ways no one asked for. She'd taken to fixing things, saddle straps, buckles, door hinges. She rearranged the tack wall so well that Samuel barely recognized it. She rarely spoke, but she no longer sat by the door like she was waiting to leave. Her silences had softened. Tula, ever the quiet hand behind the heart of the cabin, now spent her mornings behind the shed where she'd started a garden. The ground was still mostly frozen, but she knelt in it anyway, pulling at roots, testing the soil, humming under her breath. That hum had become part of the home now, like the creak of the floorboards or the click of the stovepipe. She had started placing dried herbs in small bundles on the windowsill, for cooking, for comfort, for memory. And Kaya she had changed most of all. She didn't speak more than she needed to, didn't crowd Samuel or cling. But every movement, every look was filled with certainty. She moved like she belonged. Her deer-hide dress had been repaired, stitched with thread from Samuel's old kit. Over it, she now wore his coat and a wool scarf she claimed from a forgotten chest. She had found warmth not just from fire, but from being allowed to stay, and from knowing she would not be asked to leave. One morning, as Samuel and Toma cleared the path to the barn, the boy stopped, stared at the sky, and said, "It smells different." Samuel looked around. He was right. The air no longer held the sting of death. It held something looser, something alive, the kind of smell that said the earth hadn't given up. Later that day, Kaya and Samuel stood at the fence line together. The snow had receded just enough to reveal old grass flattened beneath it. "I want this to be more than shelter," Kaya said, voice low. "I want Toma to grow up without looking over his shoulder, I want Mina to sleep without a blade in her hand. I want Tula to plant things and trust they'll grow. I want to wake up and not count the days until we have to run again." Samuel stared at the hills. "You want roots." She turned to him. "I want to wake up beside someone who doesn't expect anything from me, just to stay alive." He met her eyes. "You have that now." Her hand reached for his, not quickly, just enough. She placed it on her waist, let it rest there. She didn't smile, didn't need to. That evening, Toma sat on the porch watching the mule shed its coat in clumps. He turned to Samuel and asked, "Can I call you Father?" Samuel didn't answer right away. He knelt, reached into an old oilskin pouch and pulled out a silver belt buckle, worn smooth by years of use. He handed it to the boy. "It was mine," he said. "Yours now." Toma held it with both hands, solemn as a judge. Inside, the women watched from the doorway. Kaya stood with one hand resting on her belly. Samuel had noticed it, though no one had said anything yet. She moved differently now, protective, slower. He didn't ask, he didn't need to. That night, after the others had gone to sleep, Kaya sat with him by the fire. Her head on his shoulder, his arm across her back. They didn't speak. The fire cracked softly. The wind outside no longer howled. It hummed. She broke the silence first. "My people believe life returns when the earth is done grieving." Samuel let that settle in his chest, then asked, "Do people get that too?" She turned to him. "You tell me." He kissed her, slow, deep, like someone who'd been waiting years to remember what it meant to want something without fear. He let the kiss stay long enough to say what words could not. In the morning, the sky opened wide and clean. Rain fell soft and steady, soaking into the soil. Green pushed up through the brown. The hills came alive with wildflowers and birds. The cabin didn't feel borrowed anymore. It felt earned. Later that week, Samuel cleared a new spot behind the barn, marked it with stones, and began building a second pin. Toma helped. His small hands grasped the mallet, his brow furrowed with the seriousness of a man 3 times his age. They worked in silence, but when the fence stood complete, Samuel stood back and let the boy run his fingers across the wood. "This is ours?" Toma asked. Samuel nodded. "It is." The others came out to see. Mina brought Nail's Tula a basket of seeds, Kaya a folded cloth with feathers for the corners. They planted more than food that day. They planted memory, intention, a future. No one said the word home, no one needed to. But the fire burned through the night, and no one reached for their coat to leave. Samuel Briggs was not a man looking for redemption. He had long since buried the part of himself that sought connection. Alone in the wilds of Jackson Hole, with nothing but wind-snow and a few aging tools to mark time, he'd accepted solitude as both punishment and sanctuary. But then, winter brought more than cold, it brought a child nearly frozen to death. And everything began to shift. That child, Toma, became the crack in the ice of Samuel's soul. A boy too quiet, too thin, too close to vanishing, wrapped in Samuel's only coat. Saving him was not a gesture of hope, but an instinct of conscience. Yet, through that small act of care, life found its way into the cracks. Then came the 3 women, Kaya, Mina, and Tula. Silent at first, worn by grief, fear, and years of surviving without safety. They didn't beg, they didn't plead. Kaya merely said, "You have our son." And Samuel, man of few words, simply stepped aside and said, "Come in." From that moment, something changed. They didn't build a home from blueprints. They built it from routine repetition and shared silence. From soup cooked with dried beans and cedar smoke. From splitting firewood side by side and learning each other's footsteps in the snow. From long evenings where the only sound was breathing and the fire cracking low. Mina, who once watched the door like a hawk, began to put down her knife. Tula, always gentle, began to hum again as she stirred the stew or patched the sleeves of torn coats. Kaya, the mother, the anchor, became something more not just to her son, but to Samuel. She never asked for his love, never named it. She simply stayed, and Samuel, a man who had loved and lost, once already found that loving again was not a betrayal of the past, but a revival of the future. By the time the thaw arrived, it wasn't just snow melting. It was walls, it was fears, it was loneliness. They planted roots not just in soil, but in each other. When Toma asked to call Samuel father, there was no ceremony. Just a silver belt buckle passed between hands, a nod, and a boy who finally felt like he belonged. Kaya, with life stirring again inside her, moved slower. Protective, but not afraid, not anymore. Samuel saw it all, her quiet strength, her pain, her resolve, and met it with his own. They didn't speak in promises, they lived them. The garden behind the shed grew from frost-bitten soil. The fence Toma helped build held firm. Laughter returned, not as noise, but as music. The cabin, once silent and watchful now, held warmth not just from fire, but from presence. They stopped counting the days until departure. No one waited for the next storm to scatter them. The days stretched ahead not as burdens, but as invitations. And through it all, Samuel Briggs learned something most men never do until it's too late. He learned that family is not always born, it is chosen. It is earned through fire and silence, through shared bread and patched windows, through moments of stillness, where hearts speak louder than mouths ever could. The story of Samuel, Kaya, Toma, Mina, and Tula is not just a frontier tale. It's a reminder that healing doesn't always come with time. Sometimes it comes with people. People who show up, people who stay, people who ask nothing but give everything. So what can we take from this? What truth can we hold on to in the hustle of modern life? It is this: even when life feels frozen, when everything around you seems silent or lost, something is still growing beneath the snow. It might be small, it might be slow, but it is there. And when the thaw comes, because it always does, it's not the strongest who survive. It's the ones who stayed close, who shared the burden, who dared to hope again. In today's world filled with noise and speed, we often forget the power of simply showing up, of offering warmth, of letting someone in. You don't need to rescue anyone, just listen, just be there. Just let your fire stay lit long enough for someone else to find it. If this story touched you, if Samuel's journey from silence to family reminded you of what matters most, then we ask you to stay with us. There are more stories to tell. Stories of resilience, of connection, of the quiet ways people save each other. Subscribe to our channel and help us keep that fire burning, so we can bring you more tales like this, stories that aren't just entertaining, but healing. Because sometimes all it takes is a winter to remind us what it means to be human. And sometimes all it takes is one story to remind us we're not alone.